In today's video, we are sewing design number 4, which is grids for days. I love sewing grids on my quilt. They are so easy and so simple, but they can really accent and highlight features of a quilt top. And they can create some really nice and interesting texture and negative space on your quilts. So let's find out a little bit more about them. Hi, I'm Tom and I am the Colourblind Quilter, and you're watching the series This Is How You Quilt It. We're making a flipbook of quilting samples, so when the time comes to choose a design for your project, you can sit down with a cup of tea, flip through your book and see all the possibilities that you can use to get your quilt tops finished. But instead of just showing you the prep and the sewing steps, I'm actually showing you example quilts as well. I think it's really important to be able to visualize how a design could look on a quilt to take the fear out of quilting it. So I have example quilts to show you what's possible using this design. If you are just starting out with this video series, welcome. There is a free worksheet in the description below that has all the supplies and the prep that you need to do to sew along. You'll also find the link to the playlist that has all the previous videos so you can catch up on what we've been sewing. And remember to stick around to the end so you can see those example quilts that I was telling you about. So let's get started. Now this really is very simple and very easy. It technically is just straight lines. It suits quilts that have lots of squares in them, but it also suits quilts that have lots of blocks on points because it can create a counter pattern throughout the quilt. I like using this to create texture and negative space, and you'll see an example of that in one of the quilts later. I actually also do like using this on curved piecing, and I have an example of a quilt with curved piecing to show you that too. On the difficulty rating, this gets a score of 1 because it is so simple and so easy. So on the cuddle rating, this video scores 2 out of 5 using the example that I'm showing you. But if you are to create a denser grid by placing lines closer together, that cuddle rating would probably go up to 4 or 5. And that can be great if you're making a wall hanging that you want to hang flat. So let's look at the prep work that's involved to get this design done. We want to make sure with this design that it is symmetrical so that the left and right edges are the same. We don't want any big strange gaps on one side. So in my instance, I am going to do lines that are 1 inch apart, which means I'll have 9 lines and it will look the same left and right. So we begin by lining the ruler up with the top, bottom and left edge of the quilt 1 inch in and mark your first line. Now reposition your ruler so that it's still lined up with the top and bottom. The 2 inch line is on the edge of the sample and the 1 inch line is on the line that you just drew. And then draw your next line. You want to make sure you've got a really good sharp pencil point if you're using a pencil so that you get nice accurate lines. And then continue marking all the way across the quilt until you have marked all the required lines. Now we're going to repeat that by rotating the block 90 degrees, and then we are going to mark lines again across the quilt 1 inch apart. So repeat all the steps from the first time round. And when you're finished, you will end up with a square grid on your quilt. Now we're going to start sewing this, and we want to first secure our sample so that we can remove any pins. So pick a line that is closest to the center and sew down from the top to the bottom. Then rotate your block 90 degrees, pick another line that's closest to the center and then sew from the top to the bottom. Now your sample is secure and you can remove any pins if you're using pins. Next we are going to sew all the lines from that central line out to the right edge of our sample. Starting at the top, sewing all the way down and cutting threads and then repeating. When you get to the right edge, you are going to rotate your block 180 degrees and then you're going to continue sewing all those lines. Now we're going to flip the block 90 degrees, and starting on the left edge, we are going to sew that first line top to bottom and then repeat all the way across the quilt until you have sewn all your lines. Because we've already secured the sample, we don't need to start in the center. We can actually start on the left edge and just work our way across. And then once you reach the right edge, you're done. And it really was that simple. If you like, you can use the securing thread function at the start and end of your block. Please feel free to do that if you like that. And that was how to sew the square grid. Now, if you wanted a rectangular grid, it's very similar and exactly the same process. But when it comes to marking your second set of lines, we need to make sure that the distance is larger than the first set of lines you've drawn. So in my case, if I was drawing a grid 1 inch apart, my second set of lines, I would draw them 1 1/4 inches apart. And that makes sure that I get rectangles, but also that I get symmetry so that the left and the right edges are the same. So make sure when you pick your distance in the rectangular grid for the second set of guidelines that you have worked out the symmetry of it by taking the width and dividing it by the distance and getting a whole number. If you want to challenge your sewing skills, you can mark your first line with your pencil or pen, then you can sew that, and then get your walking foot guide, set it to the distance that you want your lines to be apart, align it with the sewn line, and then use those sewn lines as guides as you work your way across the quilt. This is deceivingly harder than you might think, because if you sew your first line squint, then what you will find is that the squintness will amplify as you work your way across the quilt. And indeed, when I first started quilting and tried to do this, my first line was fairly straight, but then as I got further and further across the quilt, it became more and more curved as I got out of line. So that can be a great challenge if you want to practice sewing straight. Remember to check how far apart your batting will allow you to sew so that you don't place your grid wider than it can be. And as I alluded to before, the closer your grid lines are, the denser this will be. So if you were making a baby quilt, you probably wouldn't want to do a 1 inch grid on it. You would probably want to do a 3, 4, or 5 inch grid depending on the size. But if you were doing a wall hanging, a dense grid would be really great for helping the wall hanging to be nice and flat and to hang nice and straight. Now let's look at some of these example quilts that I was talking about. Okay, looking at our first example, we are using the carpenter's square for this. There are a couple of different ways to do this layout. One is to make it so that the grid outlines the half square triangles that make up this block. Or the other way is to do it like this, where they're just slightly off and it creates some interesting patterns. If you look at the center of the carpenter's scar, where the lines are intersecting through that middle star, you can see it creates a pinwheel. And then looking out at the center, you can see how the grid cuts up each of these different sections to create different looking shapes. And all in all, what this does is it creates a really nice and unusual, unexpected pattern. And I like doing that because it feels unexpected. I would expect to see this quilted with a grid that highlights the half square triangles. But to me, that takes away from the illusion that the half square triangles create when they're put together in the piecing to make the stars. I really like this, and I think that it's a nice way to do this to create something that looks really quite spectacular. In our second example quilt, I'm using the Pennsylvania block from Behind the Block Series 1. Now with this one, what I could have done is I could have created the grid that was the size of the small blue and small red squares, but that would have created a very densely quilted quilt, and in fact that would have made it very stiff, which is not exactly great if you're looking for a nice soft fluffy blanket. If I was sewing this for a wall hanging, then perhaps I would have done that smaller grid to make it lie nice and flat. Instead, similar to how I did in the carpenter's square, I decided that I wanted to use the grid to highlight the bigger squares, so the bigger red and blue squares that you can see. And what this does is that in places it highlights 4 patches, in places it highlights background, and in other places it highlights the larger central squares of the blocks. And I really like how this works to create secondary patterns in the piecing by the way that it cuts the squares up. It's symmetrical, so I planned it so that it was the same on the top, bottom, left and right edges. And I like the way that when you look at this, it just creates something different depending on where your eye lands on the quilt. So this can be a nice way to tackle a grid on a quilt that's made up heavily of squares. In our next example, I was talking about how you can use grids to emphasize curved piecing. Now this is the Winding Ways example quilt. Now what you can see is I have used the grid to cut up these blocks into 4 squares. And I really love how this grid contrasts against the curved secondary pattern that this block creates. This really works very nicely, and it really creates some interest that contrasts against the curved piecing. I think if you were to introduce some diagonal lines on this, that would look absolutely amazing, but that is the subject of a future design. And then finally, the last example, I wanted to show you how we can use a square grid to contrast against a quilt that's on point. So this quilt is made up of 2 blocks. One is a square background block, and the other is a checkerboard block that's made up of 25 squares using the background and that navy color that you see. And this is a square-based block, but by setting it on point, you can see that it creates a completely different looking quilt. And this is so simple to do. And then I've added a border of the background so that it frames it, and then I added a border of the navy just so it frames it again. Now looking at this, I have gone for a denser quilt design here. I've looked at the squares and I've looked at the points of each of the squares, and I've drawn my lines so that they intersect across the points of the square. So it does create quite a heavily dense quilted quilt. But can you see how it feels like each of these lines in the grid frames each of the squares that are on point? So each of those navy squares on point feels like it's framed in its own little square, and it actually begins to look a bit like a lot of little economy blocks. Now I love this because this just creates a completely different movement through what is a diagonal quilt. Now this would still work if you were to make a slightly less dense grid. It would just change the overall effect of how the grid intersects with the blocks on point. As you can see, it creates a really nice, interesting looking effect in the negative space, the background squares. It adds something visual, some texture for your eye to find in those squares, and I really like how this looks different depending on where my eyes land on it. So again, this is not a difficult quilt to construct, it's just a checkered 25 patch on point with background squares, but adding that grid just takes it to the next level and really makes the quilt pop. So if you're doing a quilt like this, you might like to try doing this grid and see how it turns out. So those are the examples. I think they look great. I really love that this is such a simplistic quilting design, but it really can add and emphasize and really highlight your quilt and just add some fantastic finishing touches to them. So that was the Grids for Days design and the variation, which is the rectangular grid. And as you saw, it's dead easy and dead simple once you've done your prep. And hopefully the example quilts have given you some ideas of what's possible. Don't forget there's an accompanying book which is coming out later this year, and in it will be all these 21 designs, step-by-step instructions and diagrams showing you how to sew these. I'll also be adding 9 more designs that I'm not making videos for, and I will be packing it full of information and resources to help you with your quilting. So if you want to find out when that's coming out, make sure you sign up to the mailing list using the link in the description below. In the next video, we are going to be taking Grids for Days to the next level, and we are going to be sewing tartan lines with it. So if you liked this video, please do consider giving it a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed and you have clicked that bell so you get notified when tartan lines comes out. And until next time, take care.